Hello! This is Nathan, and this is the first part in a series where I'm going to be explaining everything I know about color, or at least the important parts, hence the subtitle Abridged. Now, this isn't to suggest that I am an expert in color or color science. Certainly there are plenty of people with a deeper understanding of these topics than me, but a lot of the information about color relevant to VFX work isn't widely known, especially among the indie crowd, and I'd like to fix that. Now, having said all of that about things not being widely known and such, the first two parts of this series are actually going to be about a topic that a lot of you are probably already familiar with, and that is working in linear color. And this is because even though a lot of people know it, it's foundational to everything that I'm going to be talking about afterwards, and I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So even if you're familiar with this already, I'd still recommend watching through the video because it's setting up a framework and some motifs that I'm going to be reusing throughout the series to contextualize each topic as I cover them. And who knows, you might learn something too. Okay, so let's get started. So first, what is linear color? Linear color just means that when your color values, such as your RGB values, are 0, that actually represents like real black, like 0 light energy black. And that when those values double or triple or whatever, that actually represents a physical doubling or tripling of light energy as well. So I think that's pretty simple, and in fact a lot of people probably assume that's what RGB values just always represent anyway, because after all it's kind of the most straightforward thing. It's like, yeah, of course when there's 0 that should mean zero energy, and of course when they double or triple that should mean doubling or tripling the light energy. It just makes sense, it's intuitive. And it is, like, that is the representation that makes sense. And that's also the representation where all of the math for things like 3D rendering and compositing and just everything, that's where all the math actually works correctly. But a lot of the color values, a lot of the RGB values and such that we encounter in image files and video files and such are not linear. They don't follow that proportional representation of light energy. And that leads to the obvious question, why? Why on earth would color ever not be represented linearly, since that makes so much sense and it's so straightforward? Well, there are two primary sources of nonlinearity in the colors that we store in image files and video files and whatnot. The first is something that we do on purpose, which is often referred to as gamma correction, but there's actually a larger concept there called transfer functions, and gamma correction is just one special case of that. So I'm going to be covering the broader topic of transfer functions, and that's what I'm going to be covering in this video, part 1. The second cause of nonlinearity in color, which I'm going to be covering in the next video, part 2, is something that we definitely don't do on purpose, but is just a fundamental physical limitation of camera sensors, and that is something called sensor noise. So, let's get started with transfer functions. So, let's say we have our camera here and our display, and they're directly hooked up, and this is actually a perfect camera, which is great. I would love one of those if they existed. And similarly, this is a perfect display, also something I would love to have, but as far as I know does not exist. And they're connected also with this perfect cord. And this means that if we put an image in front of the camera, it will transmit perfect data to the monitor, which will then perfectly reproduce all of the colors and brightness that the camera captured. So there's a whole bunch of problems with this in terms of reality versus this idealized situation, but the first one that I want to talk about is actually the cord itself. So this cord kind of represents not just a literal cord, it could be, but it could also be like your hard drive that's storing the data before then sending it to the monitor. Any time that you're actually trying to transmit or store the image data is kind of what this cord represents. And the reality of the cord in that sense is that it can't transmit or store infinite data. So, for example, we could store images with a megabyte per pixel. So every color is represented by a full megabyte of information, and that would be very high fidelity color, but it's not practical. So that's kind of what I mean by we can't transmit infinite data here. We need to choose some more limited, smaller unit of data to store each color in. But when we do that, we also reduce the precision of our color format. And that means that it can result in posterization because it can only represent so many different levels of brightness in each channel. So ideally, we want as small a color format as possible, but also to squeeze as much color precision out of it as we can. So to finally jump into the meat of the transfer function topic, I want to start off by giving you a little bit of intuition about one of the things we can take advantage of to improve this situation. So I have a graph here, this line kind of going up and down, and the vertical axis represents the amount of luminance, or kind of the brightness of the color. So we have black at 0 and white at 1. And then up here, you can see this just kind of matches this graph, just showing what that would look like if you actually were looking at the brightness values graphed here. So what do you think this would look like? This perfectly straight line from 0 to 1, just perfectly straight from black to white. What do you think this gradient would end up looking like? Well, a lot of people would probably expect it to look something like this. And perhaps some of you are already aware that this is not what it actually looks like. What it actually looks like is this. To the human eye, this linear increase in energy appears as if most of the change is actually happening kind of in the dark end here, and then it trails off and changes more and more slowly as it gets into the bright colors. But this is actually just an artifact of the human eye, because the human eye doesn't see color linearly. It doesn't see light energy linearly. And the classic example of this is, so if you just take a piece of paper and you have two lights that are equally bright. One of them's turned off right now, but they're equally bright when turned on. This one is currently shining on the paper, illuminating it to a certain degree. And if I turn on this other one, there is twice as much energy, twice as much light being reflected from this paper now, but it doesn't look twice as bright. And of course, this is kind of a simulated render of this, but you can actually do this experiment in real life, and it works out the same. And this is because the human eye just generally is more sensitive to changes in darker values. So, given this information, if we have a limited set of numbers, like 0 to 255, or the example I'm going to use just to make the issues more obvious is 0 to 31, so we have fewer levels, and we just map them just kind of linearly, we just have evenly spaced segments in terms of actual physical energy, we get something that's, the width of these are even, but the changes in value between adjacent rectangles here is definitely not even to the human eye. There's this huge gap at the very start, and almost imperceptible gap at the very end. And so in terms of the human eye, we're really, really not taking good advantage of our limited set of numbers here. So what we want to do instead is kind of crush them over to the darker area. So we have more of those numbers kind of crammed into the dark area to better represent the changes that the human eye is sensitive to. And you can kind of see this represented here. We have even, and this represents the middle 15. And we just kind of like drag that down and kind of crush it down. And so although the width of these rectangles is no longer even, the steps between them, the value steps, feel much, much more even to human observers. So to accomplish this kind of color encoding, where we're just trying to use the numbers more efficiently, we use something that's often referred to as a gamma curve. So this is the sRGB gamma curve, which is what most computer displays use. And you can see that it kind of curves up and over like this. The horizontal axis here represents the input linear energy, the actual physical energy that we're trying to represent. And then the vertical represents how we're going to encode those values. You can imagine that this 0 to 1 range on the vertical, you would just split this up into like 256 different levels evenly, and that would be your encoded color. And what's nice about this is that if you kind of look at how this is being mapped, like 0.1, for example, is being mapped to about a third, right? About a third of the way up. So this very tiny area in the darks is being mapped to a much larger area in the darks in our gamma encoded value. And that's exactly what we want. That means that we have more values here that we can use to represent those dark areas. Of course, once we've encoded our color this way, the numbers no longer correspond to the linear physical energy that was captured by the camera. So before we display it, we need to undo this process. And all we do is we just flip the axes here. So we turn the horizontal axis now into an input gamma encoded value that was previously encoded. And the vertical is now the linear energy, the output linear energy that we want to display. And now it just does the reverse, right? This larger, about a third area gets mapped to this 0 to 0.1 area. So it just undoes it. And these kinds of curves are broadly referred to as transfer functions. And there are a lot of them, as you can see here. I've listed some here, but the list keeps on going on. And I've graphed an even smaller set of them here. But you can see there's a lot of variation. Like some of them go from 0 to 1. Other ones go from like negative values off to way larger than 1. They just go way off the screen here. And it's really important that you know which transfer function was used to encode your color values in order to then decode them back into linear energy correctly. Now, if you've ever done color grading work, whether it's for video footage or still images, these probably look really familiar to you because they look a lot like color curves. And in fact, they are. These are identical to color curves. I mean, some of these are going, below 0 and beyond 1, but the way that they're mapping colors to other values is exactly the same. That is exactly what's going on here. And this can be a little bit confusing because color curves in grading software are for artistic purposes. They're to make the image look nicer. Whereas these transfer functions, even though under the hood they're doing the same kind of thing, are being used for a very specific technical purpose, which is to encode color more efficiently. And I like to make an analogy with zip files. So if you're going to send a text file to your friend, you might zip it first into a zip file to make the file smaller, more efficient, before sending it to them. And then on the other side, when they want to read the text file, they unzip that file first. If they didn't, if they just tried to look directly at the binary data of the zip file before being unzipped, that wouldn't be especially useful to them. They wouldn't be looking at the correct data. And these transfer functions basically serve the same purpose. It's just to make the encoding more efficient, but when encoded, it's not the correct data. So I just want to make sure that the distinction between color curves and transfer functions is really clear. Because yeah, under the hood, they are doing exactly the same thing, but it's for a completely separate purpose. So now that we have these transfer functions, we can use them to squeeze more precision out of a smaller color format by zipping our colors up before sending them across, and then unzipping them on the other side. And the result is a much higher fidelity image. And that's why almost all color formats are non-linear. That's why we store color non-linearly in images and video files and so on and so forth, because it gets us this great benefit of much higher color fidelity for storing way less data. Now, one of the things that I want to be really clear about is that this process, despite how I've drawn it here as kind of being on the wire, is actually happening internally to the camera and the monitor and the display. The camera is first encoding the colors before writing them to image files, and then the monitor is decoding whatever color data it gets before actually displaying it. And when the transfer function of the display and the camera match, or approximately match, this creates this illusion that nothing is going on. And this is why it's so easy to think that the RGB values, kind of in the middle here, are linear when in fact they're not. But if you change your camera's transfer function, for example, if you're shooting in log footage, then this illusion doesn't work anymore, and you see these washed out colors. And the reason for that isn't because log footage is washed out, it's because these transfer functions don't match. You're not decoding the color with the correct transfer function anymore. In fact, the same thing even happens with linear color. If you try to pipe linear color straight into your monitor, it is going to assume that it's encoded when it's not, and decode it, and then display non-linear color. The actual physical colors being emitted by the display are not going to be linear. And this can all seem roundabout and kind of obnoxious, but just remember that the whole point of this is to be able to send less data across the wire or store less data on hard drives while getting more color fidelity. Okay, so the main practical takeaway of all of this for VFX people is that we are working in the middle here, right? VFX people are working in the middle here, colorists are working in the middle here, and before you actually work with your color data, you need to decode it. You need to get it back into linear color, because that's where all of the math works, that's where things look right. Literally everything breaks if you're not working in linear color. Now, there is one exception to this, which is that for certain types of color grading, it can actually be useful to work in a non-linear color space. But even in those cases, you want to be working in a particular consistent non-linear color space, not just the one that the camera happens to spit out at you. So even in those cases, you still want to decode to linear first before then converting to your grading color space. The last thing that I want to mention before wrapping up with a few footnotes is that consumer level cameras like phones and pocket cameras, they don't just apply transfer functions, they actually also usually apply artistic color curves. And that's because they want their photos to look as visually pleasing as possible right off the bat for the consumer. But this leaves us in a bit of a bind as VFX artists if we get footage from these kinds of devices, because we don't know what those artistic color curves were, and we have to undo those as well to actually get back to proper linear color. So I don't have any super great advice about that, but I just want to make sure that people are aware of that, because it's definitely something that you're going to need to deal with if you end up in that situation. Okay, and finally, I have a few footnotes. And, being footnotes, none of these are super important, so you can skip this if you want, but I think some of this is at least a little bit interesting and maybe useful. So my first set of footnotes are about the term linear color. And the first thing that I want to say is that linear color does not just mean linear in the math sense. So if you're a math person, you would recognize that this graph is of a linear function, right? This line here is obviously linear, but this line does not touch the origin at 0, 0. And so in the world of color and visual effects and all that stuff, this is not considered linear color any more than, for example, this would be, right? This is also a linear function, but it's completely useless to us in terms of any kind of reasonable definition of linear for working with color. So linear color is a more specific term that means that it actually meets at 0, 0. And that is part of the definition that I gave at the beginning, but I kind of glossed over that a little bit. And I just want to emphasize that linear color is its own term that has more meaning to it than just the math sense of linear. That's part of it, but that's not the whole story. Okay, and the next thing is that if you work with camera raw footage, that is often already linear. Not always. There are some raw formats that do a transfer function style thing, but most raw formats that I'm aware of are already linear, so you don't have to linearize them, except for things like sensor noise, which is what I'm going to be covering in part 2 in the next video. It's also worth noting that sensors themselves don't necessarily actually have a fully linear response. So you could get some nonlinearity just out of the nature of the electronics of the sensor, but generally speaking, they're more than close enough to linear for visual effects purposes, and also manufacturers put a lot of effort into trying to make them as linear as possible. And the last thing that I want to say about linear color is that it's actually context dependent. And the most obvious example of this is the distinction between camera sensors and displays. So we have the physical light hitting the sensor, which we want to represent linearly. But after that, it goes through like VFX and particularly color grading, right? And in color grading, you may apply all kinds of artistic color curves, which make it absolutely no longer linear with respect to the original energy that hit the sensor. But it definitely is linear with respect to the light that you want to be emitted from the display. So after color grading, you have display linear color, and before that kind of stuff, you have sensor linear color. And this is kind of the first hint of a concept that people talk about sometimes called scene-referred color and display-referred color. And I'm going to be talking about that later on in the series, but this is kind of our first little peek into that world. And the last footnote that I have is just about the term transfer functions, because I've presented a very, very digital imaging-centric perspective on transfer functions. But actually, transfer functions itself is a much, much larger topic than what I have covered here. What I've covered here is, I think, pretty much all you need to understand for anything related to digital imaging, but I just want to put kind of a disclaimer here so that if you encounter this term in other contexts, you recognize that the way it's being used may be different or broader than the very, very narrow way that I've defined it in this video. So that just about wraps it up. I hope that was useful, and I look forward to seeing you again in part 2.